The Breakfast Club was a 1985 high school drama that locked a brain, an athlete, a princess, a criminal, and a basket case in a library for one long Saturday, and somehow defined what teenage angst looked like for an entire generation. It brought together Molly Ringwald's Claire Standish, J. Elf, Judd Nelson's John Bender, Emilio Estes' Andrew Clark, Anthony Michael Hall's Brian Johnson, Ollie Sheets' Allison Reynolds, and Paul Gleason's Richard Vernon in a single room that felt as big as adolescence itself. Released at the height of the teen movie boom, it became the John Hughes film that outlived posters, mixtapes, and even the malls where its audience first saw it. Reruns, home video, DVD box sets, and anniversary editions kept its detention doors open for decades, turning a modest character piece into a cultural shorthand for high school stereotypes and the fragile truths underneath them. Yet behind the fist pump, the David Bowie quote in that echoing library, there was a quieter story reshaped by its young cast and almost released under a title that might have buried it in obscurity. These are 15 surprising facts about The Breakfast Club: how it was cast, how it was built, how it nearly went off the rails, and how it somehow captured something honest about being a teenager in the mid-1980s. Stick around for number 15 because the most iconic image in the entire film was never on the page at all. Hit like and subscribe so you don't miss any of our deep dives into classic films that raised us. 1. Molly Ringwald quietly redirected the story. In early drafts, Principal Vernon wasn't just a strict authority figure. He was written with a voyeuristic locker room subplot that would have changed the tone of the film from the very first scene. John Hughes originally conceived an opening in which Vernon spies through a peephole into the women's locker room to watch a teacher swimming nude. Molly Ringwald, coming off 16 Candles and already central to Hughes's emerging teen universe, pushed back along with Ally Sheedy and producer Michelle Manning. She argued that turning Vernon into a peeping Tom undercut everything the film wanted to say about power, respect, and the way adults treat teenagers, especially young women. The sequence was scrapped before cameras rolled. Years later, Ringwald would write about it while reflecting on Hughes' blind spots with gender and power. But in that moment, she and her collaborators kept the film from opening on an image that would have dated it instantly and poisoned its emotional core. The Breakfast Club begins with a Bowie lyric and a shattering window, not a voyeuristic joke, because one of its stars understood that some ideas simply don't belong in a story about trust and vulnerability. 2. A David Bowie lyric became its mission statement. The first words you see in The Breakfast Club don't come from a script. They come from a song. The on-screen quote, "And these children that you spit on," piece is lifted from David Bowie's Changes, and it frames the entire film as a conversation between generations. That line wasn't part of John Hughes' original concept. During filming, Ollie Sheedy mentioned the lyric. Hughes heard it, recognized how perfectly it captured the clash between teenagers and adults, and decided to open the movie with it. In 1985, with MTV in full swing and Bowie at another peak of visibility, it gave the film an immediate sense of contemporary relevance for Sheedy. It became a point of pride. She later admitted she was stunned to see it emblazoned over the opening. One offhand suggestion turned into a manifesto. Before we meet the 5 students, before we see the school, the film quietly announces exactly what it's about. The gap between how adults see teenagers and who those teenagers believe themselves to be. 3. John Hughes stepped into the frame as Brian's father. Directors have been sneaking into their own films since the early days of cinema, and John Hughes followed that tradition with a quiet appearance at the very end of The Breakfast Club when Brian emerges from detention and gets into a car. The man behind the wheel, stern, silent, and unmistakably disappointed, is Hughes himself. He plays Brian's father without a single line of dialogue, letting the weight of that brief, wordless exchange sit on Anthony Michael Hall's shoulders. It's a small moment, but symbolically loaded. Hughes spent the film articulating the inner lives of teenagers. In the final beat, he literally becomes the adult they have to answer to. For Anthony Michael Hall brought his family with him. The opening car ride that introduces Brian Johnson feels uncomfortable in a very specific way. Sharp, familiar, and oddly personal. That's because the family scolding him isn't just fictional. Brian's mother is played by Anthony Michael Hall's real mother, Mercedes Hall. The younger sibling complaining in the back seat is Hall's actual half-sister, Mary Christian. Hughes cast them deliberately, looking for a natural rhythm that strangers might not reproduce. Having his real family play his on-screen family gave Hall a scene partner dynamic he already knew by heart. The nagging cadence, the exasperation, the way Brian shrinks into his seat. All of it comes from habits formed long before the cameras rolled. For one character, 3 different kinds of authority converge. His real mother, his real sister, and the man who wrote his anxiety into existence. It's a subtle decision that grounds Bryant's story and something unmistakably lived in. 5. Carl the janitor carries a hidden past on the wall. For most of the film, Carl the janitor sweeps through scenes with a dry sense of humor and a keen eye for teenage lies. On the surface, he's comic relief, trading barbs with Vernon and needling the students when they underestimate him. But the opening credits quietly tell a different story. On a wall filled with school honors, a plaque names him Shima High's Man of the Year for 1969. That small detail, easy to miss on a first viewing, reframes his character. Carl wasn't always pushing a broom. In his own youth at this very school, he was celebrated. He was the student everyone thought would go somewhere. By planting that plaque in the background, Hughes suggests an entire off-screen arc. The friendly cynicism in Carl's big speech about adults forgetting what it's like to be young comes from experience. He's not just warning the kids about their future. He's someone who has already lived through the gap between teenage promise and adult reality. One prop on a wall turns a supporting character into a quiet mirror, reflecting what happens when the urgency of high school gives way to the long, complicated years that follow. 6. The library was a stifling gym in disguise. The Breakfast Club is famous for taking place almost entirely in one location, the Shima High School Library. On screen, it's cavernous, airy, and bathed in soft light. An unlikely but perfect stage for the day's emotional confrontations. In reality, that library didn't exist. The production was shot at Maine North High School, a closed Chicago area campus. Its real library was far too small and ordinary for what Hughes envisioned. So, the crew converted the school gymnasium into a massive 2-level library set. They added skylights, built a mezzanine, carved out study rooms, and lined the walls with thousands of donated books from the Chicago Public Library. The illusion on screen is seamless. Off-screen, it was brutal. With heavy lights blazing and no air conditioning, temperatures in the gym reportedly climbed well into triple digits. Cast and crew described long days in a room that felt more like a sauna than a study hall. That sense of agitation and physical discomfort bled into the performances. The restless shifting, the flushed faces, the barely contained tension. They weren't acting everything. The space Hughes' team constructed looked like an oasis of quiet, but it felt like a pressure cooker. 7. Food, flakes, and smoke. Everyday items became movie magic. Some of the Breakfast Club's most memorable images rely on props that are less glamorous than they appear. When Allison, lost in her own world, leans over her drawing and shakes white dandruff flakes to create a snowfall effect, the camera picks up every grain. Real dandruff wouldn't have red under the hot lights, and flour clumped badly. So, the crew turned to something simple and effective. Grated Parmesan cheese. Under those same lights in that hot gym, sprinkling a pungent hard cheese created the perfect on-screen blizzard and an unmistakable smell. A small odd choice, but one that gave Allison's moment its dreamy visual punch. In the group's weed-smoking scene, the cast isn't inhaling what the story suggests either. To avoid legal issues and keep everyone safe, the production used oregano, a common stand-in herb that burns and smokes convincingly on camera. In the era of public anti-drug campaigns and high-profile messaging from the White House, it was a practical workaround. Behind the iconography of teenage rebellion, flakes on a drawing, smoke curling through stacks of books, there's a very down-to-earth truth. Sometimes movie magic is built from whatever the crew can find in a kitchen cabinet. If this walk through Shima High is bringing back memories of first crushes, mixtapes, or that one teacher who never quite understood you, take a second to hit like and subscribe. It helps us keep uncovering the stories behind the films that defined growing up. Now, let's head back into the library and see how this small character piece kept changing even as the cameras rolled. 8. Anthony Michael Hall grew with the shoot. Watch closely, and you may notice that Brian Johnson seemed slightly different by the end of the film. Not just emotionally, but physically. That's because Anthony Michael Hall was still in the middle of a growth spurt while they were filming. At the start of rehearsals, Judd Nelson stood noticeably taller than Hall. By the time production wrapped, the younger actor had shot up enough that the difference narrowed and in some angles reversed. Costumes, blocking, and camera placement had to adapt quietly around a teenager whose body refused to wait for the schedule. For Hall, who was only 16, the process of making a film about adolescent insecurity coincided with living through those changes in real time. His lanky posture, awkward movements, and shifting presence aren't entirely crafted. They're partly the reality of a teenager caught mid-transformation. What could have been a continuity headache instead deepened the authenticity. Brian, the brain struggling to meet impossible expectations, is played by someone literally outgrowing his surroundings as the story unfolds. 9. Entire roles ran through the same families and faces. Family ties and familiar faces run deeper in The Breakfast Club than the five students. We've already seen Brian's real mother and sister and Hughes himself as his father. But there's another layer of continuity. The use of real-life relationships and recurring collaborators to ground the film. Anthony Michael Hall's family gave his home life a sense of lived authenticity. John Hughes, who often worked with the same core group of actors across multiple projects, brought them into new dynamics here while surrounding them with people they trusted off camera. This web of connections meant that many scenes weren't just ensembles of strangers. They were clusters of people who knew each other intimately, or who had just worked together on 16 Candles. That shared history allowed for quick, shorter and overlapping dialogue and the kind of small, unspoken reactions that make the breakfast table, the circle on the floor, and even the quiet glances around the room feel eerily real. The film about strangers discovering common ground was built in part by people who already shared it. 10. The theme song almost belonged to someone else. Don't You Forget About Me is so tied to The Breakfast Club that it's hard to imagine the film without it. Yet, the song nearly never found its way to the band that recorded it, and the band itself almost turned it down. Producer Keith Forsey wrote the track specifically for the film and offered it to a series of established artists. Names like Brian Ferry and Billy Idol passed. When it finally reached Simple Minds, they hesitated. Frontman Jim Sayre reportedly found the lyrics a bit sentimental and saw the project as a diversion, not a defining statement. What changed their minds was a combination of persistence from Forsey and encouragement from Kerr's then wife Chrissy Hind of the Pretenders. The band agreed, recorded the song quickly, and didn't treat it as a major artistic milestone. Then the film opened. Paired with Judd Nelson's walk across the football field in That Rising Fist, the song fused with the film's final image. It became Simple Minds' biggest hit in the United States and a permanent fixture on radio playlists and retrospectives. A tune the band almost declined became the anthem of cinematic detention. Proof that sometimes the piece of work an artist doubts most is the one audiences hold on to longest. 11. The cast was almost someone else entirely. The Breakfast Club's lineup feels inevitable now, but getting there meant turning away several notable names. John Bender was not always Judd Nelson on paper. Early on, John Cusack was attached to play the role. Hughes admired his work, but eventually felt he didn't project the kind of raw menace and unpredictability Bender needed. Nicolas Cage was also considered, but his asking price was beyond the film's budget. On the other side of the building, Carl the janitor had a very different incarnation in mind. Rick Moranis was briefly cast, experimenting with a broader, more overtly comedic take on the character. Accounts suggest his interpretation clashed with Hughes' grounded tone, leading to a rethink. John Kapelos ultimately took the part and played Carl as Rye, observant and quietly bruised by life. The change pulled the character back from caricature and gave him a place in the film's emotional ecosystem rather than existing solely for laughs. These near misses underline how fragile casting can be. A different Bender, a different Carl, and the balance between threat, humor, and empathy might have shifted just enough to alter the film's impact. 12. The roles were nearly shuffled among the final cast. Even after Hughes settled on his core ensemble, who played which archetype remained in flux. Elio Estes initially came into audition for John Bender, the rebellious outsider. Hughes liked his work, but realized he still lacked someone who could convincingly embody Andrew Clark, the pressured athlete. Estes moved into the jock role, trading a leather jacket for a varsity one. Molly Ringwald, who would become synonymous with Claire Standish in many viewers' minds, originally campaigned to play Allison, the eccentric outsider. She saw more of herself in the withdrawn misfit than in the popular girl. Hughes, however, believed that casting her as Claire could complicate the princess stereotype, revealing insecurities and intelligence beneath the polished exterior. Ollie Sher remained as Allison, turning the character into a vivid portrait of strange, specific teenage interiority. By reassigning roles after initial instincts, Hughes ensured that each archetype was played not simply as a type, but as a counterpoint to the actor's own persona. The decisions gave the film its delicate balance. A jock who isn't just physical, a princess who isn't just shallow, and a basket case whose oddness hides an entire private world. 13. Method acting pushed the shoot to the breaking point. John Bender dominates the library with his antagonism and volatility, and Judd Nelson worked hard to make that presence feel dangerous. He adopted an intensity that didn't always switch off when the cameras did. Stories circulated that Nelson, at 24, researched the role by stepping into real high school environments, telling students his father was in jail, and buying them beer to understand a certain kind of teenage bravado. Whether or not every detail of that preparation is accurate, his commitment carried on to the set. During filming, he remained in character enough that his relentless antagonism, especially toward Molly Ringwald, began to bleed into off-camera interactions. John Hughes saw a line being crossed. Concerned that the behavior had shifted from performance to genuine hostility, he considered firing Nelson from the film. The situation was diffused in part because Paul Gleason, the actor playing authoritarian Principal Vernon, intervened on Nelson's behalf, arguing that the commitment was feeding one of the film's central performances. The tension left its mark. It strained relationships and reportedly played a part in the unraveling of any future sequel plans Hughes had once mused about. Yet on screen, the result is undeniable. Bender feels like someone who could derail the day at any moment because at times he came close to derailing the production itself. 14. Lost scenes waited more than 30 years to be seen. For decades, fans assumed they'd seen all there was to see of that one long Saturday. Then in 2017, a new Blu-ray edition from the Criterion Collection revealed a trove of deleted material around 50 minutes of never-before-seen footage. Among the rediscovered scenes is a small but telling encounter between Claire and Allison in the bathroom. Claire criticizes Allison for eating chips right after washing her hands. Allison, unbothered, uses a paper towel to pick up a chip from the sink, eats it, and walks away. Claire is left muttering, "It's not correct," already losing a battle over rules and control. The sequence had been excised from the 1985 cut, likely for pacing, but its reappearance decades later deepened fans' understanding of both characters. Allison's odd practical defiance and Claire's fixation on propriety play out in miniature in that exchange. The release of the footage also reminded viewers that the film we know is only one version. The Breakfast Club that reached theaters was shaped not just by what was written and performed, but by what was set aside and left for years in the dark. 15. The core of the film was built on improvisation. For a writer-director known for his control, John Hughes was willing to loosen his grip at crucial moments on The Breakfast Club. And those choices produced the film's most enduring images. The confession circle, where the 5 students sit on the floor and reveal why they ended up in detention, is often cited as the emotional center of the story. Instead of scripting every beat, Hughes encouraged the actors to draw on their own memories and feelings. He gave them a framework and then let them improvise within it, allowing overlaps, hesitations, and raw admissions that didn't sound polished. The result is a sequence that feels less like a constructed dialogue and more like a real, slightly awkward, deeply honest group conversation. The uneven rhythms and sudden shifts mirror adolescence itself. Then there's the ending. As Brian's essay plays over shots of the students leaving the school, John Bender strides across the football field. At the last moment, he raises his fist into the air, a gesture of rough private triumph. That movement was not scripted. Judd Nelson added it in the moment. Hughes recognized its power and built the final freeze frame around it, pairing it with, "Don't you forget about me." Without that improvised gesture, the film might have simply faded out. Instead, it closes on an image that crystallizes everything that happened in that library. Defiance, connection, and the stubborn hope that one day can matter. Hughes wrote the framework of The Breakfast Club, but he also knew when to step back. The scenes people remember most, the circle of confessions and the raised fist, exist because he trusted his cast enough to let them surprise him. Thanks for watching these 15 strange and quietly revealing facts about The Breakfast Club. Which detail changed the way you see that long Saturday in Shanghai? If this trip back to detention brought back memories of first viewings, old posters, or hearing "Don't You Forget About Me" at exactly the right moment, hit like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments which scene from The Breakfast Club still stays with you. And until next time, keep watching back.